Hello, this is Dr. Irene Hausinger, and we will be discussing illegal markets from Chapter 5 of your Babor book, Drug Policy and the Public Good. Drugs operate both within legal and illegal markets. Markets, legal or otherwise, shape use and consequences for the user, for society, for law enforcement, etc. There is a concept of the market as an abstract concept versus a physical marketplace. The abstract relationship is the abstract market relationship is between buyers and sellers, trading, etc. The physical marketplace would be where you would actually go to purchase something. Different countries handle the concept of a market in different ways. For example, Australia investigates importers and wholesalers, while US tactics focus mainly on drug dealing and violence. I would say that the exception to that is the US Coast Guard, who intercepts a lot of drug smuggling every year coming into the country. Markets can harm market participants, for example, corruption and violence. We'll go into this in more detail. Markets are effectively decentralized and individually organized, very similar to terrorist cells, and that would make sense because if you're caught, there's a lot less. It's a lot less likely that they're going to be able to go to the top if they don't know who that is, if you don't know who that is. And so even though there are cartels, most drug dealers are operating at a lower level, individual level. Now let us look at the distinctive features of drug markets. There is a great chart on page 77 that shows what this looks like. It looks like an hourglass, so to speak. You have your farmers, your growers on the top, and then you have the local trader, regional trader, the refiner, and then the exporter. And if you look at the chart, it's slightly different. You have growers, smugglers, high-level dealers right in the middle there, mid-level dealers, retailers, and then consumers on the bottom. Another way to look at this, and your book examines this concept a little bit later on, is that drug dealing is largely a pyramid scheme. Drugs trickle down from the top, but money trickles up from the bottom. The decentralized form of markets make drug markets resilient and more difficult to penetrate. Players are easily replaceable, and distribution is often inefficient because it is decentralized, which also might make it, even though it's inefficient, it might make it a little bit less difficult to trace it back up to the top because of its inefficiency and disorganization. Price is going to be affected by a lot of different factors. There are structural consequences of product illegality. There's compensation for non-monetary risks and positive relationships between retail prices and the GDP, as we talked about in Chapter 4. Most of this is greatly impacted by geography, where it's made, climate, and also are there landlocked countries? Are the countries on a corridor, a highway? Are the countries located near large bodies of water for easy trafficking? For example, most of the cocaine production occurs in the Western Hemisphere, and most of the heroin production is on the Eastern Hemisphere, and so cocaine will be cheaper on the Western Hemisphere where it's closer to home, but more expensive if it's costly to import it, and vice versa. So in general, cocaine theoretically would be less expensive here, whereas heroin would be more expensive. Okay. Illegal drugs are more expensive compared to legal drugs, with the exception of pharmaceuticals, because of the amount of research and development that goes into making pharmaceuticals. We can compare the costs to coffee, and there's a nice chart on page 81, table 5.1, markups along the distribution chain for legal and illegal commodities, where you can look at legal items such as coffee and silver versus the prices for cocaine, heroin, and cannabis resin. High prices may reduce consumption, and later on your book talks a little bit about, well, what are drug use patterns like? If prices are really high, Will some users stop using? Yes. Some users might also try to find substances that are in a similar classification of drugs, um, or they might try to make their supplies last and dilute them and make them even more dangerous by adding adulterants to it. High prices may increase risk of financial ruin to users, increase of poverty, increase of health problems, which are risk factors for each other. We have product quality. There is no real regulation because it's not legal. And so one of the things that you hear about in the news oftentimes are quote unquote bad batches of cocaine or heroin that might be cut with things like fentanyl. I think I mentioned it's becoming increasingly popular to cut cut drugs like cocaine with cat tranquilizers and other types of drugs that are not meant for human consumption. Oh, an exception here is the internet market. Uh, there was a website on the dark web called the Silk Road, and it effectively operated like an Amazon or an eBay for drugs, where you could give the seller a rating. And I would like to argue that perhaps this led to harm reduction in that people were reviewing the products and rating the sellers, and they wouldn't buy from people that had shady reputations. So this, I think, could be an argument for the regulation of drugs. It could keep people alive. Anyways, we have an unknown quality and adulteration. If you are a lower level dealer, and the majority of dealers are, especially here, if you're dealing heroin and the heroin's coming from Afghanistan, it's passed through many hands before it gets to yours. You can't speak to how pure, in quotations, how pure the heroin actually is. There is an argument that diluting the product could cause harm in terms of an increase in purity and the risk of overdosing. And then again, we have the risk of impoverishment. And another interesting criteria here, time consumption for drug users, which is actually one of the DSM-5 criteria. Are you spending a lot of time getting it, using it, and recovering from it? So because this illegal drugs are not something that are consistently readily available, and by that I mean if you're buying vodka, you know where to buy vodka. Most stores will always have vodka. And if a store doesn't have it, then you can easily go to another store that will have it. That's not the same for heroin or cocaine. You could spend hours driving around trying to find contacts. And this really contributes to the volatility and chaos in a drug user's life, is their product is not guaranteed. It's not as something that is readily available. And that is one of the criteria for the DSM. So one of the arguments in the Chasing the Scream book, and we could read between the lines here too, your authors of the Babor book are certainly very scientific and are not really advocating one way or another. But if drugs were legalized, we might see a decrease in crime because you would be able to regularly get it. And one of the comparisons too is opiate addicts that are on methadone replacement programs or Suboxone. A lot of those individuals can find jobs and can have functional lives because it's something that is regulated, safe. They know when they're going to get it. They don't have to plan their whole, have to plan a lot of things around it. Right? Maybe some things, like if you have to wake up at 5 and go to the methadone clinic, but outside of that, you have the rest of your day for perhaps legal or normative social activities or work activities. So one of the arguments is that if we were to legalize drugs, then we would see more steady employment among drug users. And that's the way that it was before the early 1900s, before everything was made illegal. So it's just some food for thought. Another distinctive feature of drug markets is the corruption, particularly in regards to production and trafficking. Cocaine and heroin account for most of the world's illegal drug trade. And we know from the United Nations Drug Report that cocaine has resurfaced with a 56% increase over the past 2 years, which is huge. Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru account for about 90, this should be 90% of the world's cocaine production. Afghanistan and Myanmar account for 95% of the world's heroin production. Iran and Turkey are responsible for trafficking between producers and consumer states. Some harms include bribery and undermining the state. And your textbook authors say it is easier for drug production to take root in places with a pre-existing culture of corruption, and it can add to the economy potentially. They also note that it is rather rare for drug dealers to rise to governmental power. That's something that's kind of glamorized by Hollywood, but a little bit rare. Okay. We have market harms, which is the diversion of sellers' productive time. So not only the user, but they are arguing that drug dealers, drug sellers, drug traffickers could be contributing to society in a more productive and socially normative and less illegal way. There have been experiences with physical marketplaces, such as the Swiss experiment for Needle Park, which was abandoned. It did increase the presence of drug users. And then the broken window idea that if neighborhoods have broken windows and are overrun, then the idea to the dealers and to people with illegal activity is that if there's crime allowed to be there, then they're less likely to run into law enforcement. Okay. And we do have property crimes. Property crimes, maybe to get drug money or to get items that you could sell for drug money. Okay. And then, of course, the cost of illness. So once again, one of the recurring themes is harm to self or harm to the user, and then harm to larger society. Okay. And as a review from Chapter 4, we have psychopharmacological crime, economic compulsive crime, and systemic crime. Most of the market-related harms are a consequence of efforts to reduce drug use, most notably the laws and associated programs prohibiting the production, distribution, and possession of illegal drugs. And your authors state, it means it's worth asking about the option of legalizing some forms of drug supply, but it does not necessarily mean that another drug regime would better serve the public good. The benefits of reduced use and abuse arising from prohibition may well override the market harms that prohibition creates, but that is an empirical question. We must also be mindful that the level of market-related harm is not an immutable constant. Just as some programs and policies can aggravate or ameliorate the harms associated with drug use, other programs and policies can aggravate or ameliorate the harmful consequences of drug markets. Even if harms related to the illegal markets currently exceed the benefits prohibition delivers through reduced abuse, the best response might be reforming prohibition, not ending it. Things to consider. I'll see you next week.